Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today I'm going to show you how you can use batch painting methods to get a bunch of miniatures on the table very quickly with a minimum of fuss, and I reckon not looking too bad. Now these guys are from the Ratkin Warband from Mantic Games, and they very kindly sent me along a bunch of rats to have some fun with and do sort of a review and painting video. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I thought of the miniatures when I put them together, and then we'll get on to the painting. So as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get a look at these guys and get started. So before we got started, I thought it would be worth having a look at the miniatures themselves. Reason being, there are some differences between these and the Skaven which are worth knowing about if you're going to make that leap. Now I don't have a Skaven nearby to compare it to, unfortunately, but I can tell you from experience, these guys are a little larger than clan rats that you get in boxes these days. Their proportions and their overall size, they are about on par with the older plastic Skaven or the old metals, if you remember those. Bigger heads, slightly bulkier bodies, but otherwise, about the same. You can see on a 20mm square base, they look about the same. They do take up the same size. But one thing I really like about these guys so much, you'll see here, and you'll see it better once it's painted, but he's got his tail tucked down against his leg. And that's true of all of them. So you don't have to muck around worrying about whether or not you guys are going to rank up or knock into one another when you're trying to assemble a unit. Which also matters in Age of Sigmar when you're trying to push as many of them as close together as you can, especially if they've got spears. So I don't know that I'd look at them as a direct Skaven alternative, but they certainly are something that you could use for that. So with that in mind, I'm going to paint them honestly fairly similarly to how I have done Skaven in the past. But this time, because I've got something different to do, I'm going to use just the Army Painter products and see what we come up with that way. So you'll see my other little dudes lurking in the background here. Let's get started. Now one last note on the miniatures themselves. While I do really like the Ratkin models, there's a quick note I've got to give you on these Mantic bases. Now the one that this fella is sitting on at the moment, this is an old Games Workshop one that I had spare sitting around. Reason being, these little divots that are in the top of these Mantic bases, some of their miniatures have a little round essentially secondary base that the miniature is cast on. So you plonk them down in the center of that base and jobs are good 'un. The Ratkin don't have that. So you have to glue their feet sort of perched on the edges of that gap. I don't like it. And I've got to be honest, it's the one thing about the kits which stands out as a bit of a bummer. Particularly because the edges are slightly beveled on these, so you can't just flip them upside down and get the same result. But it's a minor bugbear, something really tiny which has a very easy fix. Just something to be aware of. If you do pick up a box and you don't like that, you're going to need to find some extra bases. So after starting from a primer of leather brown, the first thing we're going to do is actually all of the metal work, and we're going to be pretty rough about how we apply this. I've got a big ragged old brush. This one comes from the stationery aisle. You can use anything you like here. And I have some gunmetal. What I'm going to do is jab most of this into my brush there. Just work it in. Now I don't want to dry brush this, but I don't want to just splodge it across the miniature. So starting with a shield here, this is a good spot. I'm just going to start dragging across the surface of the area a few times, and that'll be fine. These little bits of brown and grime that are in the background there, they're going to help us when it comes time to shade. So I am going to do this to most of the miniature, because you see he's got chains and what have you all around him, little steel bowlers and such. And when it comes to his weaponry, you can just flick across and jab it a couple of times. That's plenty. So let's do that to this fella, this fella, this fella, and so on. Now this doesn't take very long at all. I'm talking maybe 20 or 30 seconds per miniature. So we are looking to be quite rough with it, because the finished effect is really going to be more pronounced when we have our mob on the table. Now with the metallics laid down across those 5 guys, that really only took a couple of minutes. What I'm going to do now is basically the cleanup stage with the rest of these colors. And we're going to start off with his skin, and I'm using tanned flesh for this. just a little bit of water in my brush, and I've probably got a bit too much there. What we're going to do is start applying this straight to the areas of skin. Now, something I do really like about these guys is they've actually got gloves on. Like, all of them have got big chunky leather gloves, which is going to make it an absolute doddle to paint their hands later. So, one quick coat of this, you'll see we do get some of the primer still showing through, but we can come back later once that's dried. And of course, when working with 5 miniatures, by the time I've finished all of the skin on this fella, so on the last fella rather, this guy will be ready for his next coat. Now that's what one coat is going to look like. So you'll see there is still a little bit of that brown showing through once that's dry. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to quickly smash on some of the high points. I'm not too worried about making sure that the gaps between his toes are properly base coated, just really big areas like arms and his tail. Now once we've got that tanned flesh on all of these guys, I'm actually going to move to another skin color. And here I have Barbarian Flesh. Now I'm still using my regiment brush here. What I'm going to do is just start vaguely sketching some of the outlines of the musculature and then leaving it like that. If you leave just tanned flesh, then when we shade him, he's going to go really, really dark. But for areas like knees and just blap, blap, blap quickly along his toes, this is going to add a little bit of visual interest when we shade him, and we'll make him look not quite so dark. So on each of these guys, you can just pick out, because these miniatures are really nicely done, I have to admit, when it comes to some of these areas of musculature, you can just quite quickly splatter this on. So I'm going to go one quick coat of Barbarian Flesh over all the areas I want to accentuate on these 5 guys. Now with all 5 of them done, you'll notice that I've been quite messy. It's really quite impressionist. You're just picking areas that you want to stand out a little bit. And as my grandfather would say, geez, boy, that looks rough as guts. But you put them at arm's length, and suddenly you can see they've still got a bit of texture to them. It means they don't photograph up close particularly well, unfortunately, but we're not painting for photos, we're painting to put miniatures on the table. Now what we're going to do is move on to their clothing, and there's a way that you can sort of skip some of the details here and make this go a little bit quicker. So I'm going to pick 3 colors. Now what I'm going to do is use Necromancer Cloak, Dirt Spatter, and Hemp Rope as my clothing and armor colors. Now the miniatures that are on the cover of the Ratkin Warband box, they don't have a lot of color to them. They're really more grimy brown. So I've deliberately chosen colors that are fairly similar in approach. What we're going to do is this. Now you'll notice that most of these miniatures are designed in such a way that they've got a top piece of clothing, then some shorts essentially, and some of them will have a little leather cover over their faces. So starting with Necromancer Cloak, I'm going to paint, let's just say, the top piece of this guy, then the hood on this guy, and then the shorts on this guy. And by mixing up your color pattern like that, just picking 3 colors and painting essentially random parts on each rat, you're going to find that you end up with a fairly ragtag looking unit, but which doesn't have a lot of different colors and will still look like a essentially uniformed bunch on the table. Then I'll switch to my hemp rope and we'll start doing that same pattern in the other direction. So this time it's going to be the trousers or shorts on this guy, and then the hood on the next, or his sleeves or whatever. And in that way, we get that nice ragged finish. And then any remaining areas of clothing that you haven't painted, I've got my dirt spatter. Now you might have clocked that the colors that we're using don't actually matter. You can swap these out for whatever you've got, or whatever you think would look cool for your rats. Now with the clothing sorted, it's time to move on to just a handful of other details. So I've got here Banshee Brown, and I'm going to paint in any arm wraps, because there are a couple of miniatures which have these. You'll notice it doesn't cover perfectly, but not to worry. We'll come back and give this a second coat once this is dried on each of the fellas we're going to use it on. As well, I'd recommend, well, this fella hasn't got any teeth showing, but Banshee Brown is a nice base coat for any teeth. So let's just pop in there real quick. Now there are a few miniatures which will have skulls and such on their belts as trophies. I don't want to surprise you, but skeleton bone would be my choice for doing this. Now a thoroughly useful colour that I really like is Monster Brown. This is a great everything else kind of colour. So, for example, these little pouches or satchels or what have you, anything remaining which looks like equipment, just give it a quick blast of Monster Brown. And same too, straps on weapons or spears, you can very quickly give a blast of this as well. Now speaking of those spears, it's up to you if you do want to paint the wood on these, but I've got werewolf fur for this. Now strictly speaking, you'd probably find that spear wood would be a slightly lighter colour, but I like dark, so... Now we're using quite a few browns on these guys, but I'm moving now to fur brown. Reason being, there are a few areas of, well, fur. So I'm just going to poke in here around the bottoms of their little mutton chops. And as well, flick them up a little. This is quite difficult to show you on screen, unfortunately. But there's normally a couple of little tufts of fur just towards the front of their mouths. So make sure you don't miss those either. And now for our last sort of tidy up stage, we're going all the way back to leather brown. Now any areas that you've missed while painting, like right up close to their chests, where their armor and such is, don't worry about it. You know, the leather brown in those darker areas is going to act as shading. But for gloves and such that are up, front and center, we do want to tidy those up. So a little bit of leather brown now to do that job. Now in the optional but will look cool stage, I have a little bit of true copper. And I'm going to use this just to pick out a few panels on some of the shields and a couple of bits of armor, just to add a little bit of visual interest there. Then finally, for the first and probably only time you're going to need a smaller brush on these guys, a little bit of black to paint in their wee boopy noses. Now once you've got all of your base coats on at last, this is ordinarily where I would say to you, okay, now go back with some of them and tidy up any mistakes. Honestly, don't bother. You're going to paint so many rats, you will not see them, so just skip that stage. I'm going to go now to Agrac's Earthshade, and the reason I'm using this instead of Strong Tone is really one of just, I like having the pot there. Having to get it out onto a palette, it slows me down a little bit when I'm painting large numbers of infantry. So instead, we're going to use this. The same approach applies. We're just going to bucket it fairly generously over the whole miniature, making sure any recesses that you do really work it in there. And then once this guy's had a thorough bath, we'll do his friends and we'll leave them for about half an hour to dry. Now individually they aren't much to write home about, but the unit when it's finished up like this will look pretty cool. What I'm going to do is just a couple of quick dry brushes to accentuate some of the areas of colour, because I don't want to do a huge amount more work to these, but I think we can, improve them a little bit. So I'm going to start by taking some plate mail metal and a small dry brush, and I'm going to very lightly use that to flick along some of the extreme edges of the metalwork, just to accentuate them with a little bit of silver. Now don't worry about going overboard with this in some flatter areas. You'll see it does actually give quite a nice variation in colour. Now for some of these dry brush highlights, we're going to want to switch to just one colour. You could do this before your shade if you wanted to, because it'll help tie together some of this, but don't worry too much if you do it at this point like I'm going to. Let's put our rat down for a second, and what I've got here is just an old cardboard lid with black spray over the top. Any black primer will do, but you'll hear there's a very faint surface to it. It's not perfectly smooth, which is great because we're going to use this to get an idea of what we're going to dry brush. So I've got here some brain matter beige and a wedge tip makeup brush, which is going to help us to do flat areas very quickly, but we can also tilt it and get into some sort of smaller areas without having to worry too much. So now what I'm going to do, now obviously if I try and dry brush with that, I'm going to leave a dreadful mess. So let's get most of that off. And then Yeah, perfect. You see, we're not going to leave much behind. So let's get here my rat again, and we'll start with his gloves. Just lightly across the back of his knuckles here, and then along the back of his wrist. Very quickly, we have a nice simple highlight. Now we can do this as well along his face. So you see here the edge of his cowl. I'm going to tilt my little brush sideways and lightly flick upwards against the areas of detail. This will take a few passes to build up that color, but once you do, you can stop and you'll see, okay, real quick highlight. Same do with the green, we'll do it again. Brain matter beige, the ultimate dry brush. So over skin, over clothing, over equipment. That one dry brush just adds a third sort of highlight to everything very, very quickly. Is it perfect? No, but we aren't looking for perfect. And frankly, that'll look just fine once it's on the table. So I'm now going to do that to all of my rats. Now for a quick group shot from the front and the back, you can see that it's not perfect, but again, we're not going for perfect. This is really simple, and I do suggest that dry brushing is one of those things that you want to have a practice. As well, rats are the perfect place to have that practice because if you make a mistake, you put too much paint on one rat, don't worry about it. Just put them at the back of the group. You'll never have to look at it again. What I'm going to do now is take these guys outside, hit them with a matte varnish, and I'll pop a base on them, nice and quick, and we'll see what we look like when they're all finished. And there we have it, our Ratkin are complete. And I got to admit, I really enjoy doing these. The kits themselves are super quick to assemble, and the results, well, they look pretty good. Having 5 of them out does make it a little bit difficult to get them on the spinny thing though. So you'll have to trust me, they look as good from the back as they do from the front. Let's spin him around. So again, thank you very much to Mantic for sending these along. I had not really seen these guys on my radar just yet, and since a fair few people I know are interested in, well, large mobs of troops, then the Ratkin are a really good way to get a bunch of rats on your table. As well, with Kings of War, I don't believe it uses individual model removal for casualties. So if you don't like the square bases, same as I do, you can actually just make a unit base and put a whole bunch of miniatures on that, which I think is pretty cool. So thank you very much to Exo23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.